Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thanks everyone for joining this latest installment of the Pac-12 Access to Justice series. I want to introduce to you Margaret Hagan. Many of you know Margaret, so I will be brief. Margaret is a native of Pittsburgh, from a family of lawyers. She herself went to the University of Chicago and Stanford Law School. During her time as a law student, she took courses at the D School. After graduating from the law school, she did a fellowship at the D School to work on applying design thinking to the law. She then moved into a position at the Center on the Legal Profession, where I work, and has built the Legal Design Lab to great success, working to make the law more accessible through application of design principles, which sometimes involves technology and sometimes does not. So I will then turn it over to her, Margaret Hagan.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. So happy to hear your questions and thoughts. So feel free to be putting stuff in chat, and hopefully we can make this as interactive as possible. Today, I'm going to be talking about this notion of justice innovation and how law schools in particular can play a role in increasing access to justice through new models of services, technologies, and policies. I'll give some examples and help you make sense of this burgeoning world of justice innovation, hopefully. I know many of you on the call do work in this space, so really looking forward to seeing your ideas and what's happening at your universities to make sure that we have a diversity of experiences to talk about. I'll be talking specifically about Stanford's. And I'll also highlight at the end some forward directions about where universities and policymakers might focus in on in the next few years. So let's start with just this notion of justice innovation. For those of you who are not deep in this space, like myself or Stacy on the call, so many of you are already aware about the access to justice crisis in the US, but just to reiterate some numbers, these come from LSC's report on the justice gap and unmet legal needs in the US as of 3 or 4 years ago. So many, around 70% of households that are low income experienced at least one life problem that we as lawyers know is a legal problem that could be dealt with in the civil justice system. So that could be around accessing healthcare or paying for it, dealing with housing conditions, landlords and mortgages, disability access, getting veterans benefits, dealing with domestic violence, and protection of your family. Many of these legal problems, these life problems that are justiciable, are not actually getting legal help. That Justice Gap survey from LSC reported that 86% of problems are not ending up in front of legal aid lawyers, in court self-help centers, or in the civil court system. And some of that problem is about the lack of legal aid service providers. That in the year 2017, there's people coming with almost 2 million problems to legal aid providers, but many of them are turned away because those providers are overburdened, understaffed. There's not enough capacity to deal with that volume of problems. And many of those legal needs, as Becky Sandifer's work has shown and other legal needs surveys around the world have shown, most of these needs are not ending up with good legal advice, going through a court process, getting to a formal resolution. Not to say that every life problem needs to have a court process to resolve it, but knowing that there are these rights and protections out there and that many are not making use of them. Some of these needs surveys do spot that family law issues do tend to end up more in the justice system, and that those in work and employment, debt and money, housing tend not to make it into the justice system. So we know some of that from this wonderful access to justice research out there. So then the question is, how do we make the system work better? Because whether it's from the perspective of the self-represented litigant, a person who has just gotten a summons in the mail telling them that they've been sued by their landlord or by a creditor, or judges, clerks, frontline staff and legal aid organizations, law professors, many of us can see that the system is not working efficiently in a humane way, not actually solving people's problems and keeping them from bad outcomes, whether it be housing instability, poverty, other types of insecurity. So how do we make the system actually work better for people? Now, in academic literature, we can find a few strands where this kind of intersects with legal scholarship. So many of us are familiar with that notion of the naming, claiming, transformation of problems into kind of justiciable claims. So that can be one way that we can link this kind of access to justice crisis on the ground to legal scholarship. That part of the problem that Sandifer's work is identifying is that people are not naming, blaming, and claiming, that their life problems are kind of going without being transformed into legal ones. Or another frame is thinking about increasing the number of people who actually are able to address these justiciable problems, these life problems that could be resolved. And so there we can link into this literature around civil legal needs, legal capabilities, the work from a lot of legal sociologists. We can also link this to other scholars working on uptake of benefits. So why aren't more people using these public services? Why aren't they attending their court hearings? Why aren't they filing claims in the courts? Why aren't they using government services or kind of legal benefits that they might have? And there are quite a number of scholars like J.J. Prescott and James Greiner working on kind of the question about increasing uptake, different interventions to get more participation in the system. And then finally, there's this new thread of scholarship in legal academic, among legal academics around the promise of technology. And if 10 or 15 years ago began kind of a hype cycle of getting very excited about the promise of technology tools, technology systems to make a dent in the access to justice crisis, how we as scholars can evaluate, really, does that work out as promised? What are some of the backlashes or unintended consequences? And does the reality live up to that hype? So at Georgetown, Tanina Rostain's work, and then in the UK and now Australia, Katrina Denver's work, kind of spotlighting, does this tech actually provide access to justice? And what are some of the unintended consequences that we can see? So there are these different threads in legal scholarship that are asking these questions. But I think, and this is part of the presentation today, kind of thesis, is that we need, especially in law schools, more applied research and development and incubation of new models to actually focus on what can work to increase access to justice, picking up on all those threads of scholarship, and then doing more research in the field to see how this real crisis can be addressed. So now I'll turn to the role that law schools can play in this world of justice innovation in increasing access to justice. So over the past decade, there have been many, many innovation labs that have sprung up both in government agencies, but then also in universities. In law schools in particular, there's this world of justice, design, innovation labs. And you can kind of search online and see how many of these are springing up. So it involves kind of hands-on learning, often in an interdisciplinary way. So for example, at Stanford, our lab is very consciously borrowing methods, tools, and kind of expertise from across campus. So whether that's from our D-School, design school, from computer science, or machine learning and natural language processing, sociology, kind of other fields, and trying to draw their expertise into these problems of the justice system with the goal of making the law work better for people. So the way that our lab is run is, it's not exactly a clinic. And yeah, it's run more like a team. So we have 3 full-time staff, myself, a policy and design lead, and a full stack developer. We have around 10 student research assistants who are working either in kind of law and policy specifically, design and data, or design specifically, or CS and data specifically. So we have students from across campus who are all interested in justice innovation. And then we have other faculty and staff leads across campus who also have some kind of overlap with the same issues and systems that we're talking about. So what our lab actually does is we run classes. Often this is the time where we are scouting out new partnerships and new models and seeing if this is a good fit for a longer term investment. We also have funding from different foundations and nonprofit organizations to then incubate and actually build out new interventions. So whether that's a technology tool, data standards, document designs, I'll show some of those examples, but then we can actually, with our staff and research assistants, build out new things to put into the field and then evaluate how they work. We also have a new model of leading cohorts. So when there are courts, government agencies, legal aid groups that are interested in innovation and want to come up with new practices, bringing them together into peer learning groups and then spreading, giving technical assistance and supporting kind of more scaled out change rather than one-off pilots. So I'll talk about this more in a little bit. So that's just kind of the text view. And now this is the more schematic view, just so you can see we have this classes and workshops thread. Then we have the research and development projects. And then we have many of these partnerships out in the field. Our theory of change, how we think we can make a dent in the access to justice crisis, is this idea. This is a drawing from a talk I saw last week from Nigel Balmer, who's a UK academic now in Australia, doing research with the Victoria Law Foundation. He studies how we can build more legal capability among people in the public. And his point of view is that we need more designs, we need more ideas, more proposals, more interventions that can democratize access to legal services. So like Jason said at the beginning, that's not just new apps. It could be better information design, presenting the law and legal information so more people can understand it. It could be more campaigns, branding, and marketing to make different kinds of legal services more approachable, more understandable to people. It can be new regulatory structures like innovation sandboxes. It can be new service models like community lawyering. But basically, there needs to be the switch from just thinking about the solution to access to justice as kind of more legal aid lawyers, to broadening that notion and thinking about other types of interventions and improvements that can really build capability among the public and get more participation when they are sued or when they have a right to assert. So basically our logic model, building off of that idea from Nigel, is that our innovation lab at the university has that capacity, those interdisciplinary connections, and the luxury of being at a university and being able to experiment, to design and vet new models, that we can have these classes and partnerships and ongoing incubations where we can try out new designs and technologies, services, and data standards or regulatory structures to see, can this increase legal help to more people? If we can then put that out in the field, then we might be able to improve people's legal capability. We can improve their knowledge, their confidence, their ability to do legal tasks, all these things that are part of this notion of legal capability. If we make people more capable, then hopefully we'll get them to participate in the legal system more, especially when their family, their money, their job is at risk. And then hopefully that then translates into kind of making a dent in those access to justice numbers, that more people are able to protect themselves, more of their justiciable problems are getting resolved. So university-based innovation labs are one of the prime sites that can actually incubate new models. We know that legal aid and courts are stretched thin when it comes to budget, staff, and capacity. They don't have innovation budgets. They can't really do research and evaluation very well. This is kind of a luxury, and universities are uniquely positioned to be able to kind of take time to do this. And we have a lot of wonderful people power from students, staff, and faculty to do this kind of work. So our lab uses an innovative mix of methods and designs and partnerships to do this kind of work. We are really following these notions from across campus from the D School, that when we are tackling a challenge, trying to improve services or a system, that we need to go and talk to people, that we in the ivory tower can't just speculate about what will work, but we need to be on the ground, interviewing people, watching how the system works, gathering data about behaviors and performances. And we also need to invite stakeholders in on the process, that they're helping set the agenda and also contribute to the ideas. And then we have this commitment to experimentation and evaluation, that we're never going to get the solution right the first time, that we have to be open to improvements and refinement. So what does that look like in practice? It means, like, let's say, for example, we ran a class with the California court system. This one was back from winter 2017, to make the guardianship system work better, in particular for self-represented litigants in California. So it's going out and actually speaking to people pre-COVID times, going into or coming out of their court hearing in the self-help center waiting room, just kind of asking them about their experience, what they're here for, how it's been so far, how they've managed to navigate this process, what they're frustrated about. Also then talking to repeat players like advocates, to hear what trends they're seeing, what holes in the process they'd spotlight. We start to map things out. We bring the students together and we try to spot where there are big opportunities. And we do lots of mapping, both user experience mapping of what the process, what the legal process looks like for a self-represented litigant, and then also mapping out the rules and the procedures of the systems, kind of the doctrine and the practices on the ground. Then we start doing the kind of more creative work. If we can have these opportunities spotlit where on those maps there are major problems, let's start brainstorming how we can fix them. How do we change Boston Housing Court, for example, in this photograph, to be easier to understand, more supportive of a person about to go into their eviction hearing? Let's come up with like 100 different ideas, these kind of really rough concept ideas. So at this point, we're not writing memos. We don't have a formal proposal, but it's coming up with really obvious low-hanging fruit versus like very futuristic, conceptual, unexpensive new ideas. And then presenting those back to stakeholders for them to say, you know, this one's really far out, but it has potential, or we've already tried these four and they definitely don't work. But kind of putting out a lot of ideas to then find a few good ones. Bringing folks in, whether it's litigants, judges, clerks, bailiffs, legal aid staff, to say like, upvote on this, downvote on this, totally change this. Having these kind of co-creation sessions so they can take some of those post-it level ideas and then help us flesh them out or reject them. As we start to build out ideas, having these kind of testing sessions really early. So even before a pilot, having folks come in and tell us very critically what's confusing, what's wrong, what's right, what would work or what wouldn't work for them. And especially with new technology products, really putting them through the ringer with user testing. Then going into a pilot model of, with our partner, whether it's a court system or legal aid or a government agency, then setting up kind of a limited time pilot, sometimes with a randomized control trial evaluation in the rare instances when the partner is open to that, or a pre-post or some other kind of evaluation where we can see, is participation increasing? Do people report having higher levels of procedural justice? Do we see changes in people's use of the justice system? So evaluating is always hard. We can talk about that at the end, about why there's resistance to RCTs on the ground, but trying to get that field pilot and evaluation to then get things right. And then if that pilot then proves to be impactful in the way we intended, then putting that out as a model for other groups to replicate. So for example, we finished up RCT with Hamilton County Court in Cincinnati. We tried a new eviction summons meant to encourage more people being sued for eviction to attend court, to use legal aid services, and to come as prepared as possible for their hearing. We studied if that reduced default rate. It did. And now we're making that model summons available to other jurisdictions and helping them replicate that, and also an evaluation study in their jurisdictions. So the goal is scale eventually after those one-off pilots. So let me just give you some examples of what's come out of our lab and what other labs can be working on. So again, it's not just about tech. That's probably the biggest refrain. So this pyramid can give you kind of the spectrum of what's possible to create that could make a dent in the justice crisis. Better visual designs, new products like tech tools, websites, and apps, new service designs, how we give kind of human services that can help people through an entire journey, new org designs, new system and policy designs. So let me show you some examples. For visual designs, I just mentioned that court summons project. So in this one, we were invited in by the clerk of courts in Hamilton County, Ohio, Cincinnati area. And much like many other jurisdictions, that piece of paper that people are served with when they're sued for eviction by their landlord is pretty intimidating. Lots of legalese, black and white, very dense. Really hard to figure out what to do next or even what is happening with this document. So we worked through several workshops with tenants, landlords, advocates, and the court staff through that document, wordsmithing it, figuring out what was statutory language and what wasn't, and also then thinking about what could be helpful on that document. What does a tenant receiving that in the mail actually want to know to be able to participate in court? And then we went through a big design process, spent a lot of time figuring out how much we could squeeze onto one page. And we ended up with a new design that's much more about using behavioral cues and supportive language to get people to know exactly when and where to show up. The main message here is please do not default. Show up to your court hearing. Here's when it is, here's where it is. Here even is a photograph of the court building so you don't go to the wrong justice center in downtown Cincinnati. And also second message is reach out for help ASAP. Because even if the hearing is not going to go your way, the sooner that you can get a counselor or a lawyer to help you make the housing transition plan or figure out if you have a defense, it's much better off for you the sooner you get that help as possible. So we put a big get help box in the middle with clear language, phone numbers, a texting line, all of this to kind of increase that outreach for help. So we're still gathering the numbers, but we're able to track if people who received this notice versus the old notice used the self-help center more, reached out to legal aid more, and showed up to their hearing more. So we'll be having a publication on that soon. But we really do feel that these pieces of paper make a big difference in whether people participate or not, and whether they default or not. We've also made kind of step-by-step guides. We were working on traffic court and ability to pay for several years with different California courts. So we experimented with very visual narrative guides to basically how you can make that ability to pay argument to get a break on your traffic tickets, telling a story of how Triangle Man did it so that you can too. Also, similarly, walking people through those stages of responding to a debt collection lawsuit, and this one was more for the actual service providers. This is in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, where a few lawyers were trying to get more of a coalition around eviction prevention. But one of the sticking points was how hard it was to explain this process to other government officials, funders, policymakers, that the process is so convoluted that these well-educated people couldn't follow it. So we did a giant process mapping and then kind of made this visual guide that could be shared with all these policymakers so they actually understand what all this different language around eviction actually meant and what the timeline looks like. Another category, tech tools, what you probably think of when you think of innovation. So these are ways to make it easier for a self-represented litigant to take action. So one thing we've been working on are kind of better websites that can walk people through step by step how you get through a lengthy, complicated legal process, like filing a restraining order or getting your driver's license restored. So that involves making sure that we think about things not in statutes and laws, but in the step-by-step almost recipe of what it takes to get through the process, what documents you need, where you need to spend money, what services are available at each step. So kind of doing this mapping and then presenting bit by bit information to a person. We're also working a lot on text message based interventions because we keep finding in our testing that that kind of short chat-like communication resonates very strongly with people who are feeling overwhelmed, don't necessarily have a desktop or a big screen to be looking at, and want a kind of back and forth. So whether that is kind of one-way broadcasts from a court or a legal aid, updating them about their case, telling them when to come and where to come, or a more interactive kind of chatbot-like experience with FAQs, with intake questions, other things. We're seeing a lot of promise and engagement with text-based platforms. Last year, we also built our own first huge website. We have a big website called legalfaq.org. On that, we have all the COVID-specific emergency rules around eviction. We stood this up very quickly and put plain language, frequently asked questions, answers for every single different states. We have 50 different pages on there. And this is in response to basically how bad the internet is at answering people's legal questions. And we figured out, talking to Google and their search team, that FAQs, if you as a website present kind of that question answer format on your website, you're much more likely to appear high and appear in one of those special boxes that you might see if you search a sports score or weather, kind of a priority box on the Google search result page. So we figured we could try to put really plain language, understandable and authoritative FAQs out there for each state, and then have it show up higher on Google. So people hopefully would get to public interest sources rather than anything that would be misinformation. That's turned out to be quite successful. We have many thousands of visitors every month, usually over 2,000 per day. So we're thinking about how to scale that further and how to get more quality information online. Okay. Next category is that more advanced tech. So not just websites and apps, but using more data and AI. So a few examples here. One is using data to understand what people's legal needs and their behavior around those needs are. So now that more people are going online, whether to online law help clinics like Free Legal Answers, ABA's project, or to Reddit's subreddit legal advice, or even to like Facebook moms groups or Craigslist groups. And they're asking questions like, this weird thing happened to me with my landlord. I think he was harassing me. Do I have a case? What can I do? I live in Ohio. What are the laws? We can use all those online traces, all of those data sets to start spotting, at least for the given demographics of a platform, what legal needs people are having. So we've been collaborating with the ABA on their giant online clinic, Free Legal Answers, to then map out what the most common legal needs we're seeing are. You can see one of those maps here. Family and children, definitely one of the highest. Housing and finance and money, kind of the usual suspects according to legal needs surveys we're seeing replicated online. But now we're also able to see kind of seasonal patterns, what words people are using, also what kind of help they're seeking out. Taking this one step further, working with Suffolk University's Innovation Lab, the LIT Lab, our lab with the help of Pew Charitable Trusts then built a tool called Learned Hands. It's still online if you search Learned Hands, it's a website, and it's basically a game-like interface. And we have law students read these short stories. These ones are from Reddit Legal Advice, which is a publicly available data set, no PII there. And we have law students read these people's stories and then tag them about what legal issue they see. Do you see a family law issue here? Do you see a housing law issue here? Those tags from law students then can help machines learn how to spot legal issues. Basically, that's the training data to feed the natural language processing tool, the machine learning tool. So now Suffolk Lit Lab has taken all of those labeled stories from Learned Hands and has built this tool called Spot. Spot is an AI tool, a natural language processing tool that can look at an excerpt of legal text and then try to predict what legal issues might be there. A legal issue spotting tool. You basically share with it either a search query someone has put in onto your website or a story they've put on there, and then Spot will answer back what legal issues it sees present. It's not always perfect, it's still learning, it's in progress, but its ability to spot issues is getting smarter every day. So for example, we're experimenting with whether on, let's say, Reddit legal advice, we could have Spot look at the posts being put up, and if it sees a possible eviction or housing issue, it can then, the bot could then reply, "Hi, it looks like you might have a housing law problem. If you do, here is a legal aid website that you can visit to find more kind of public and free legal help," trying to get them basically to an authoritative public interest resource based on the legal issue that might be there. The final category is at that more structural level, how we at law schools can incubate policy and other kinds of reforms. So one thing that we had been working on a few years ago was like the notion of prototyping policy. How do we use the design methods I mentioned earlier, but to then conceive of new policies? We ran a big workshop back in 2018, and we had innovators from different financial services labs there. And they were talking all about a regulatory sandbox model, how in different countries like UK or Singapore, they had used this kind of sandbox regulatory structure to try out new policies or allow new types of entities to offer services that were kind of in a blurry space when it came to whether regulation applied to them or not. So we wrote a piece about this. We talked about whether it could be applied to legal services, a regulatory sandbox. And then it got picked up by a working group in Utah with the judiciary and the bar. And now it's a full-blown, amazing pilot program to have kind of a legal services innovation sandbox in Utah and possibly in other states. So that came out of some of those early design sessions, and we were able to then feed it into that ongoing work in Utah. We also do a lot of work. This is one of my colleagues, my fellow staff members, Nora Al-Haider. She's been working over the past year with courts to kind of set up new policies, procedures, and even architectural rules about online courts and these kind of hybrid courts. She's actually working with MIT and Harvard Graduate School of Design for these collaborative classes on how to design online courts, both in terms of rules and procedures that protect due process, as well as the actual design and setup and kind of physical booths that might be in courthouses. She also has been collaborating with the very famous fashion designer Virgil Abloh on this as well. So it's kind of an amazing collaboration across many fields. It's very exciting to see where they're going. Another thing that we're working a lot on is setting out an agenda of kind of a short list of what innovation looks like in a given space. So for example, we're working heavily in the eviction and landlord-tenant space and curating down a list of kind of the most promising policies that a given jurisdiction could roll out to prevent evictions. And along with that, like I mentioned before, we've taken this new model to try to scale of leading a cohort. So right now, our lab, in partnership with the nonprofit National League of Cities, has a cohort of 30 different cities across the country, all wanting to work on eviction prevention and innovation. So we are having monthly, if not bi-weekly, peer learning meetings, design sessions, workshops, answering their questions about how to implement new pilots, how to evaluate them, what the best practices are around setting up a new diversion program, or getting a court to open up an emergency rental assistance help desk, or doing social media outreach. So trying to spread all of these new pilot ideas, promising practices to as many jurisdictions as possible. So I think scale is one of those big challenges, and this is our attempt to try to get past the individual pilots to something more scaled. So I'm almost done. Just here's a few future directions I wanted to highlight. So there's definitely a lot to do with more inter-university, more cross-discipline, and more kind of global exchange. I know it's very hard to work across all these different geographic or university or discipline boundaries, but that's where we're going to get to the most impact. So I'm really excited to think about more directions there. I think we also just need more metrics, more instruments to actually evaluate whether it's a website or a service or a document. Is it actually increasing people's legal capability and legal participation? Is it increasing access to justice? So because this is kind of a nascent field of applied research, there isn't that kind of bank of instruments to draw on. And oftentimes partners are very resistant to these randomized control trials and other types of evaluations that academics would like to see. So trying to find those new study designs that are more feasible, especially in emergency situations where policymakers want to just move, and how we can do good academic research at that pace and fitting with their feasibility concerns. And there's also the question of integrating with traditional law faculties so that clinics, or not clinics, that labs are not these kind of like offshoots that are in their own world and not embraced or understood by other people in the law faculties. So really trying to find ways that this intersects with scholarship and doctrinal work, because it often does, but we just don't want to be siloed off. So I'll say thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen. I'm happy to chat. Thanks for listening to all of this.